And again, what does the United States do about this? Is hard power useful? Well, we've been using one form of hard power, which is basically military assistance to try to prop up some of these regimes, but that doesn't get at some basic issues of power, which is, for example, the legitimacy question. You know, you take a corrupt, weak state that can't provide basic health and education for its citizens, you know, a place like Mali or Niger, where you've had a lot of this kind of activity, or Nigeria, and you give weapons to the existing government, and what happens to you? You get a lot of blowback because they're not going to use these in a way that will necessarily benefit all of their citizens, although everybody has this common interest in stability and security. All right, so this is, I think, part of the, and so this is why I was resisting a little bit when people said Iran is the most important problem. I mean, it is a big problem. I don't deny that, but in a way, the problem is a much more understandable and in a certain way more tractable problem with Iran, because Iran has had a state for the last 3,000 years, basically. You know, there's always been a coherent government in Iran. In fact, that's something that people don't understand when they're dealing with Iran, because I actually think that there's a lot of continuity in Iranian foreign policy between this Islamic regime and earlier Persian regimes that, you know, they've, despite all this fearsome rhetoric that comes out of Tehran, they actually, I think, have a much stronger sense of themselves as a state. And therefore, when you deal with them, you do things like you go to Geneva and you negotiate. You know, you say, okay, we'll do this and you do that, and let's see if we can agree. Now, we may not be able to agree, come to an agreement, but at least you've got some feeling that if the Iranian regime actually agrees to something with the international community, that they've got the power to actually make that stick. They may not want to do it. There may be internal politics, just as there is here, but at least they've got a state. Completely different story in Pakistan, right? Neighboring Pakistan, which has been the focus of the biggest aid program in American, you know, in the American portfolio, where you've got daily bombings in Karachi and Quetta and up in the northwest frontier. And by the way, just as an indicator of how weak that state is, the entire tribal belt, this area of largely Pushtun tribesmen along the border with Afghanistan, where Osama bin Laden went to hide and all of the al-Qaeda folks found their sanctuaries. Traditionally, the Pakistani government didn't even try to exert its own authority there. Like, the authority only extended to the roads, and everywhere else was under tribal control. So historically, you know, the state, the Pakistani state, was not even present there. And so we've been trying to launch drone strikes into these tribal areas. Why do we have to do this? Well, the Pakistani military itself has not been able to control militants and terrorists, partly because they don't want to, and partly because physically it's just, you know, they've never been able to exert legitimate authority in that part of Pakistan. All right, so that's the weak state world, and that's why I think traditional forms of power aren't very useful. I guess in the interest of time, I had this little historical excursus into why the 2003 Iraq invasion was a mistake, because I think that what the Bush administration was trying to do was treat the question of weapons of mass destruction and proliferation as if we were living in this old strong state world where Saddam Hussein was the mastermind of, you know, a big proliferation and terrorism network, and if you got rid of him and replaced him with somebody else, you'd solve that basic problem. And I think that was an analytical and a foreign policy mistake of very large dimensions, because in fact the broader terrorism problem was actually not the result of the state use of terrorism, that is to say, Saddam Hussein giving aid and comfort to al-Qaeda, as the Bush administration was asserting, but rather the fact that you got these weak states all over the place where these terrorists can operate without any without any states to sanction them. And actually, Saddam Hussein was kind of sitting on a lot of those forces. And now in Iraq, if you've been following the news coming out of Iraq, what do we have up in Fallujah and Ramadi and these other parts of the Sunni Triangle? You have a return of the kind of civil war that we saw back in 2006 during the American occupation, because unfortunately, despite all of the money we put into state building in Iraq, there's no state there either. All right? So what do we do about this if hard military power is not that useful in this kind of a situation? What other tools do we have? And that's why I wanted you to read the counterinsurgency field manual, which has it's Field Manual 3-24. So it's very interesting. In a certain sense, the US military itself has slowly but surely come around to a recognition that we are dealing with this weak state world, right? So in the Cold War and up until the 1990s, the dominant field manual used to train military officers was Field Manual 100-5, which was their combined arms field manual, which was basically a doctrine about how to fight a big tank-on-tank war in Europe, all right? Where you have big divisions, heavy equipment, and you're fighting a coherent state. That's what we thought we were going to do during the Cold War. And actually, it proved pretty useful in the 1991 Gulf War, because Saddam Hussein's forces were not very good, but they were organized in big tank armies. And so we actually implemented that manual and defeated Saddam and didn't unseat him, didn't solve the problem, but at least the military part of it was recognizable. This didn't work in Afghanistan or Iraq, because once you had defeated the conventional forces, Afghanistan, you didn't have conventional forces at all, so you had to take that over with special forces and very unconventional forms of military power. But what we discovered was the use of hard military power was very counterproductive, right? Traditional doctrine is kinetic. And what that means is you blow things up with heavy artillery and ordnance and lots of firepower. You intimidate, destroy, disable your enemies until they surrender. But if you do that in an urban environment like Baghdad, where what you're trying to do is actually recreate a democratic, stable, legitimate state, if you use power in that manner, you're actually going to make things worse. You're going to alienate people. You're going to get all of this political blowback. And so after we went into Baghdad in March of 2003, this famous Thunder Run, I mean, heroically, in terms of a military operation, it was great. But then 6 months later, an insurgency starts up, and the insurgents are all living among the citizens that you are ostensibly there to help. And how do you deal with this kind of problem? Now, just to be fair, so I said that the old traditional world was one where you had a lot of coherent, strong, centralized states. That's not quite true, because during the Cold War, we actually were dealing with insurgencies and weak states. So you had the Philippines, Malaya, Central America, places like Guatemala and El Salvador, where our local allies were not terribly strong, coherent states, and where you did have these kinds of popular insurgencies, and again, where the overt use of large-scale military power was counterproductive. However, the army that came out of the Cold War didn't like this. They love tank warfare. I mean, it's high-tech. It involves the kinds of skills that Americans are really good at. And the kind of army that went into Afghanistan and Iraq wasn't prepared for this kind of warfare. And so what you had over the next 6 to 7 years was this extremely painful doctrinal shift away from traditional combined arms warfare to what is called counterinsurgency. It actually didn't involve so much new learning as kind of remembering what the US military once knew in Vietnam and El Salvador and the Philippines and places like this. And this leads you to a very non-kinetic, form of warfare. So having read that counterinsurgency, at least a chapter out of that manual, what's the primary objective in a counterinsurgency war? So a kinetic war, you want to destroy the opponent's military capacity, and once you do that, you get what you want. You exercise power. Right? How do you exercise power in a counterinsurgency war? Yes? Hearts and minds, all right? As a friend of mine at RAND, who dates all the way back to counterinsurgency in Vietnam, said there are three objectives in a counterinsurgency war. First objective, win popular support. Second objective, win popular support. Third objective, win popular support, all right? Without that popular support, you cannot accomplish the military objectives you want because your enemies are hiding in the population that you want to win over to your side. And therefore, you have to engage in a very different kind of operation. So how do you win popular support in a place like Afghanistan, or at least according to the field manual? What kinds of things do you do? Yeah. Okay, so what do people, so let's imagine that we are in a poor rural village in Afghanistan. You've got Al-Qaeda people coming in from Pakistan, you've got the Taliban, and you've got this government in Kabul, which is notoriously corrupt, heavy-handed, relies on a lot of old warlords. So what does an ordinary person in Afghanistan, what do they want? What's going to win their support? If you say that popular support is critical, what's going to win that support? Yeah.
Security in that case.
Okay, security first and foremost. But how do you win security in a village that is remote and rural, in which the insurgents are hiding up in the hills, that basically you can go patrol in that village, with your conventional forces during the day, but the moment nightfall comes, they're back in the village intimidating people. So how do you do that? Yeah.
So if you can win over basically the minds of the people in the village to an extent where they feel that it is in their best interest to
Right.
oust the enemy element, so by providing the medical supplies.
No, that's okay. So that's exactly right. So it turns out that part of the hearts and minds strategy, the villagers are looking both ways, right? So maybe they don't like the Taliban, they may not like President Karzai, but they want security. They want to be left alone, they want economic development. They're not going to rat on the Taliban coming into their village at night if they think that you're not going to support them and protect them from the Taliban. So assuring them that you're going to be there for the long run in terms of security is very important. But they're farmers, they're trying to raise their families, and if they don't have a source of economic development, they're going to say, okay, well, maybe the Taliban can at least help us in the drug trade or something of that sort. And so you get this whole non-military economic and sort of social side of development that then becomes very important in executing the counterinsurgency strategy. And so one of the innovations that the military came up with that goes back to the CORDS program in Vietnam were things called PRTs, Provincial Reconstruction Teams, that combined hard power, guys with guns, with USAID officials and people providing development assistance and so forth.